going to completely peel back that romanticized, glittering Hollywood veneer of the vampire. We're digging into the eerie, suppressed, historical, and psychological realities that actually birthed this myth. Today, we're exploring how the very real, crystallized terrors of our ancestors essentially coalesced into a single, menacing shadow that has stalked humanity through the ages. We'll be looking at the historical proof, the truly terrifying folklore that goes way, way beyond some guy in a cape, and the deep psychological roots of these ancient night terrors. Let's dive right in. We have to start with physical proof that the belief in vampires wasn't just a scary story. Historically, it was treated as an absolute terrifying reality. What you're seeing here are the centuries-old remains of a woman, exhumed on the island of Lazaretto Nuovo in Venice, pulled right out of a mass grave of 16th-century plague victims. Now notice the massive brick wedged forcefully between her jaws? Yeah, that wasn't an accident. In those days, a brick positioned exactly like this was a ritualistic exorcism. It was a desperate, panicked measure taken by terrified gravediggers to prevent a suspected vampire from returning to spread the plague. They genuinely, literally believed she was going to rise from the earth, bite the living, and infect their entire community.
So let's jump into Section 1, Graveyard Science versus the Myth.
You might be wondering, how did this belief become so incredibly widespread? How did a complete lack of early scientific understanding convince our ancestors that monsters were physically rising from the dirt? Well, picture this. You're an 18th century villager. People in your town are suddenly dropping dead of a mysterious illness. You dig up the first person who died, suspecting some kind of foul play from the grave. And what do you see? The body looks unnaturally fresh. It's bloated. And there's this dark, dried fluid around the mouth. To you, the villager, this is incontrovertible proof. It's a freshly fed demon. But what those horrified villagers saw as the supernatural was, in reality, just graveyard science. Certain chemical elements in the earth acted as preservatives. That ruddy complexion and freshness, actually just post-mortem bloating. And the blood around the mouth was simply the natural, albeit completely grotesque, purging of bodily fluids during decay. They were witnessing the terrifying reality of human decomposition, but their minds created a monster to explain it. To truly grasp this ancient dread, we have to understand that early medical science viewed blood as something profoundly spiritual. Back in 1607, a minister named Thomas Walkington wrote, "In the body the blood, in the blood the spirits, in the spirit's soul." And get this, there were actually medically authorized living vampires in 13th century Europe who engaged in medicinal cannibalism. These weren't supernatural monsters. They were actual people drinking human blood to stave off the rigors of age and death. They firmly believed they weren't just swallowing a physical fluid, but gulping down the very force of life itself. So, a physical attack by a vampire wasn't just a loss of blood. It was the literal consumption of a person's vital spirits and their indestructible soul.
That brings us to Section 2, Beyond the Human Form, where we look at these unpredictable entities.
Okay, you have to forget the handsome count in a tuxedo for a minute because historic vampires were infinitely stranger. We're going to look at 3 little-known but absolutely terrifying ideas about what vampires actually were. First, many of them didn't drink blood at all. They were pranic or psychic entities that leached your energy, your vitality, and your goodness right out of you while you slept. Second, they didn't even have to be human. In certain cultures, vampires could literally be the chair you sit in, the growing vine outside your window, the shadow you cast, or even a weird reflection in a mirror. And third, if you look at folklore like the Boo Daddies of South Carolina, witches who became vampires could actually remove their skin and travel at unbelievable speeds as a ball of hellish red or yellow-red light. I mean, just imagine the paranoia that would cause. The everyday, mundane world around you suddenly becomes intensely predatory and completely unsafe. Historically, evil was almost always associated with the bizarre and the unusual. The visceral, primal fear of a vampire attack wasn't based on cultured aristocratic dilettantes. No, these beings were grotesque, monstrous, and sometimes entirely formless. The crucial takeaway here is that these unpredictable forms weren't just meant to scare a single person in the dark. They were the terrifying catch-all explanation for community-wide devastation. There was zero room for complacency when the monster killing your town could be literally any object inside your own home. Let's move on to Section 3, Harbingers of the Plague and the Absolute Fear of Contagion.
Think about what happens when communities are suddenly decimated by a mysterious plagues like smallpox, cholera, or the bubonic plague. There was no germ theory back then to explain why entire families were being wiped out one by one. So, who took the blame? The freshly buried undead. They were branded as the carriers. A victim dying of a plague often had a glassy stare and would cough up blood. In a supernatural context, these symptoms were interpreted as the victims slowly turning into a vampiric being themselves. The vampire became a literal scapegoat for disease. In fact, the main goal of the vampire, even more than just drinking blood, was thought to be spreading infection wherever it possibly could.
In this ancient association with disease and vitality, it all circles right back to a single powerful phrase: the blood is the life. Now, you might recognize that as a line famously repeated by the character Renfield in Bram Stoker's Dracula, but it actually originates from the biblical book of Deuteronomy. Blood is the basic physical requirement for our survival, but to the vampire, it's the deeply symbolic elixir they steal to reverse death itself. To be drained of it was to be drained of life, and to be infected with it was to be entirely doomed. Finally, let's explore Section 4, the Mirror of the Mind, focusing on Eros and Thanatos. So what portion of the human mind do these creatures actually represent? Mythologically speaking, the vampire represents the concepts of Eros and Thanatos. That's the dichotomous psychological relationship between love and death. Why is the legend of the vampire so incredibly enduringly attractive to us? Because it directly mirrors our very human absorption with the phenomenon of death, which is Thanatos, heavily intertwined with the strangely erotic allure of eternal life, which is Eros. Vampires are perfectly suspended between the two. Think about it. Biting someone on the neck is an intensely intimate personal act. From their dark, shrouded world, vampires hold forth the ultimate promise of immortality, but it comes at a terrible, corrupting price. So, when we strip it all back, what exactly are we left with? The vampire is not merely a pop culture icon. It is, as the source material eloquently puts it, the crystallized terrors of our forebears coalesced into one menacing shadow. It's the literal, physical manifestation of our ancestors' absolute deepest fears regarding uncontrollable disease, the terrifying unknown lurking in the dark, and the inescapable, haunting reality of our own mortality. We've seen today how vampires are so much more complicated, diverse, and downright eerie than Hollywood ever suggests. They are drawn from a suppressed history of devastating plague, heavily misunderstood science, and deep psychological dread. So as we wrap up this explainer on these ancient night terrors, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought. Considering that historically, a vampire could take the form of the very environment around you. When you turn off the lights tonight, are you completely certain you are alone? Or are you sure that shadow in the corner is really just a shadow?